All right, guys. So what I wanted to talk about today was moderation versus mediation for a few reasons. A, it's one of the trickiest concepts we've learned about so far. B, no one has quite got it right in the discussion posts, so that makes me think that there's room for further explanation. And C, explaining moderation versus mediation is best done in a sort of an in vivo discussion type environment where I can explain, you can think of examples, and I can correct you in real time. So that's what we're going to be doing today. I'm going to walk through moderation versus mediation again, broken down in a lot of detail. And then I want you guys to help me think of a couple examples of moderation and mediation. You give me the variables, and I'm going to sketch them on my whiteboard. At that point, then, I'll break you guys into breakout rooms, and in pairs, you can come up with your own examples of moderation and mediation. We'll come back here together, and you'll tell me about your examples. And again, I can sketch them on the whiteboard. This is, again, meant to approximate as much as possible the experience that I've had in regular in-person semesters of trying to help people break through in terms of their understanding of these concepts. Okay. So when we're talking moderation and mediation, both technically are classified as sorts of what we call interactions. Any interaction is a more complicated set of variables that all interplay in unique ways when all taken into account together. So it's sort of the sum is more than its parts individually. When three variables all interact, it means that when they all are combined, something sort of unique and special happens. So both moderation and mediation could be called a type of interaction, but they are different. They are very distinct. Moderation is when you introduce a third variable into the mix that, in a sense, changes the correlation between two underlying variables. This is not in a causal sense. It's more so that the nature of the correlation between X and Y somewhat hinges on what's going on with the Z variable. So I'm going to break that down in a lot more detail, because the main misconception that I saw in the discussion board posts were people who named two variables, they named a third variable, but then when they sketched it, they only sketched a regular correlation. And that's not going to depict a moderation. So you weren't quite getting there. You need to think about how the Z variable impacts the correlation between X and Y. And there's a really quick and easy way to make sure when you're conceptualizing and doing your sketch, you're having the Z variable interplay with the correlation between X and Y. Mediation, on the other hand, is when you think a third variable helps you explain why there is a correlation in the first place. And again, this is not really in a causal sense. It's maybe more so through knowing that one variable, your variable X, tends to boost a variable Z, and then the outcome is a variable Y. So there's lots of examples where there's a correlation between X and Y, but you think there's an intermediary. Again, the distinction between these two, it is complicated and it is hard, and it is nuanced, and it does, in my experience, take a little bit of a breakthrough moment for students to really understand that these two things are different, and making sure that your examples demonstrate a moderation versus a mediation. Mediation is going to be depicted with that triangular diagram. So in terms of a really quick way to make sure that you're depicting moderation versus mediation correctly is going to come down to making sure you're doing certain things with your graphic visualization. Now I'm going to break down moderation a little bit further. I showed you several examples of depictions of moderation, and they all shared certain features. Both of these two visuals depict what we would call a moderation, whereby a third variable impacts the relationship between your first two variables. So key things to note about both of these graphics. One is that I have a legend, is what I call it, defining levels of the moderator. When I initially defined moderator, I said that the level of the moderator would impact the underlying correlation. What that means is that at different levels of the moderating variable, the strength or direction of the underlying correlation is a little bit different. So to make sure that you're identifying levels of the moderator, you're going to need to create something like this. What is actually depicted in the legend depends on the moderator you identify. If it's a moderator that is categorical in nature, name the categories. Have a legend that indicates which line denotes your female participants versus your male participants. Over here in this depiction, we've got a moderator that's actually more quantitative in nature, something like social support, that has been defined in terms of people who have high, medium, and low social support. And these 3 lines here depict those 3 levels or those 3 distinct groups. So if you don't have something like this that's setting you up to draw those multiple lines in the graphic, you are likely not actually involving your 3rd variable, your hypothetical moderator, into your visualization at all. So you're going to need to create something that looks like this. Think about what your moderator is. Is it categorical? Figure out the categories. Is it not categorical? Just have a high versus low group. Easy as that. And as I mentioned, the legends correspond to the different lines. The multiple lines are meant to depict the different levels of the moderator, right? So this line here depicts the first level of the moderator of gender. So this is the women line. This is the men line. Similar, you need a legend over here indicating that this first thickest line indicates the people who have high social support. This line indicates people with a medium level of social support. This is level 3. So your legend needs to correspond to your different lines over here. And when I say a legend, basically it's just an indication of what these bars will look like. A lot of the times I do a solid bar and a dashed bar. If I have 3 groups, I do a solid bar, a dashed bar, and a squiggly bar. I'll show you that later, just as long as they look different. And then here is the real key to making sure that you're putting this into the context of moderation, i.e. the 3rd variable, changing something about that underlying relationship. The slant of the lines that you create should be different. You see how this line is basically horizontal and this line is sloped downwards? That tells you that depending on level of the moderator, the correlation between Facebook use and extroversion is different. So here's a huge misconception I kept running into. People would say, I think that gender moderates the relationship between social media and self-esteem because women have lower self-esteem. That is implicating the moderator with one of the first 2 variables, and that's not moderation. That's just identifying a separate relationship. The key is to say that gender is somehow impacting the strength of the correlation between your first 2 variables. Again, a really quick and easy way to make sure you're doing that, draw these different lines at different slants. That indicates strength of the correlation is different. As we covered in correlations, a horizontal best fit line tells you that there's no correlation between your variables versus a slanted one that tells you that there is. And the direction tells you whether it's a positive or negative correlation. With some moderations, you could have the direction flipped, so those 2 bars perfectly crisscross. It could be that for one level, the line is horizontal and the other has a correlation, or you could see something like what we see over here on the left, where those lines are just oriented or slanted slightly differently. So basically what these 2 graphics depict in terms of the moderation they are depicting is that for this one on the right, gender is moderating the relationship between Facebook use and extroversion. So I've got my underlying variables depicted on the Y and the X axis. I've got levels of the moderator identified, and those lines at their different slants indicate different strengths of correlation for men versus women. So the takeaway is that gender moderates that relationship. Over here is another example of moderation. It's not that for any one of these groups, the correlation between, in this case, stress and depression goes away. There is a positive slope to all of those lines. What's interesting is if you look at this line representing people with high social support, this thickest line, that is not sloped as steeply. It's closer to 0. It's more horizontal. What that means is that for people with a lot of social support, there is a weaker relationship between stress and depression. Right? There's a relationship between stress and depression, but you can buffer it with a high level of social support. For these people, the more stressed they become, yes, they're more susceptible to depression, but not as much as the people up here that don't have that social support. So again, these lines just being oriented at a different slope indicates that moderation may be present. So it can look like this, it can look like this. Key is to have all of these features here. Your XY variable depicted along the Y and X axis, a legend indicating levels of the moderator, and the actual lines that depict the underlying correlation being different by levels of the moderator. Any questions so far on moderation? Again, you'd have to turn your mic on because I can't see the chat right now. Okay, you'll have a chance to ask questions later, obviously, but for now I'm going to move on to a mediation. Mediation, on the other hand, when I was showing all of these triangular looking diagrams. So mediation is a completely distinct type of more complex relationship between variables. Okay, first off, to make sure that you're living in the world of mediation, think triangles, think triangular model. From there, you can conceptualize your variables and plug them into a diagram that looks like this. But if you're not using this diagram, you're probably not depicting your mediation adequately. So this was another example of a mediation that I showed you. This was the example from nostalgia research where the researchers found nostalgia was associated with relationship goals, so intentions to resolve a conflict, for example. Now they thought this is interesting, but that seems like a slightly more complex relationship than just nostalgia making you want to go resolve fights. The researchers speculated that there was a mechanism or a go-between, that nostalgia was doing something that was in turn doing something to relationship goals. So they hypothesized that nostalgia more proximally boosts your social confidence, right? Think about how that makes a little bit more sense than nostalgia kicking you right to relationship resolution. Nostalgia makes you remember all of the times that you were with loved ones, that you were with your friends, that you had a good time. So you're thinking about these social memories and it's making you more confident socially. Confidence is more proximally associated with this intention to resolve conflicts. So this sort of temporal sequence goes, nostalgia tends to boost social confidence, which tends to boost your intent to resolve your fights with your loved ones. So the idea is that this relationship between nostalgia and intentions is not actually changing as opposed to moderation. Don't be confused by this pathway dropping to non-significant because this relationship is not actually changing. It's just that through the mediation, we explain why this is here in the first place. So that is a huge point of confusion. Mediation does not mean the relationship is changing. That non-significant pathway is just an artifact of your regression analysis telling you that there's a mediator. Okay, so a few things to note about mediation. One is that this bottom pathway here should be your X to Y variable. So what correlation are you trying to explain? So you start by thinking to yourself, what's a correlation that I think exists out there that's maybe a little bit more complex than meets the eye? But make sure that to start off building your diagram, this bottom pathway here, your variable X that you're using to generate predictions, and your variable Y, your outcome or your DV over here. The top variable should be your proposed mediator, which again is a third variable that you can label as your variable Z. So up at the top should be whatever you're speculating is the variable that helps explain this underlying correlation. So what really is the key to a, holy shit, did I say moderator there? I did not mean to do that. Do not pay attention to my mistakes. I'm so sorry. Okay, that is your mediator. Then these pathways here, from here to here, that is what indicates that mediation may be present. So then it's a feature of regression analysis that drops this pathway to non-significant. It's not that that correlation has disappeared, nor has it even changed. It just indicates that we can better explain what's going on here by taking this mediator into account. Okay, so that'll do it with my first part of re-explaining moderation versus mediation. What I'd like to do before breaking you guys into groups is have you guys throw some variables at me, and I will sketch them on my whiteboard, and we'll come up with some visualizations together based on the variables that you're interested in, and then in your breakout rooms, you can come up with some more. So let's start with moderation. You guys can see this, right? All right, so either turn your microphone on or share in the chat to get moderation started. What are two variables that you think may be associated that you think maybe a moderator might impact? So just give me a couple variables. People are just logging off instead of doing this.
Exercise and mental health.
Sure. So let's say anxiety is over here and exercise over here. Do you think the correlation between anxiety and exercise is positive or negative?
Positive.
You think the more exercise you do, the more anxious you get?
Oh, sorry. I was thinking it backwards. Yeah, negative.
So you probably assume that that relationship looks like this. Now, let's think about a possible moderator that might impact the correlation between anxiety and exercise. Should we just do gender? It's an easy one. Let's have women be a solid bar and men be a dashed bar. So like I said, to really ensure that you're thinking moderation, this solid line needs to be oriented differently than this dashed line. So maybe you think for women, the correlation between anxiety and exercise is like negative, but slightly. Like women are just more anxious and we can only do so much, but maybe for men, that relationship is much more strongly negative. Men are more able to drive their anxiety down with exercise. So the reason this depicts moderation is because I have these two bars and they are oriented differently. Make sense? All right. So now let's try a mediation. All right, so to start off, you need to think of two variables that may be correlated that you will seek to explain with a mediator. So what's a couple variables that we think are correlated together?
GPA and test scores.
Sure. Scores. The exam score. Okay, so the idea is there some way that there's an intermediary that helps us explain why people with higher GPAs tend to get higher exam scores? Maybe they study more. Maybe they're more confident. It doesn't matter if this is real or accurate. It's just about depicting it in a way that demonstrates mediation. So you start off by thinking, what are two variables that I think are associated? And then you just identify a possible go-between. The idea is there's this positive relationship between GPA and exam scores. Well, it's because GPA boosts your confidence, and it's your confidence that more so boosts your exam scores than just your GPA on its own. So this would be a hypothetical depiction of a mediation. Okay, So I think I'm going to stop the recording at this point and just take any questions if you guys have them.